You're standing in a dimly lit great hall. The air is thick with the smell of wet wool and smoke from a dying fire. Outside, rain lashes against the castle walls, the wind screaming like it wants to tear the stones apart. Beside you, a young noblewoman sits on the cold flagstone floor, her wrists bound with coarse rope. Her eyes dart to the figure standing in the shadows, a man in full armor, the glint of his mail catching what little light seeps through the shuttered windows. He steps forward. You recognize the crest painted on his surcoat, the lion rampant of a knight sworn to protect this very house. You expect him to untie her, to speak words of comfort, to live up to the stories sung by troubadours. But the knight doesn't reach for his sword to defend her. He reaches for the latch on the hall door and bolts it shut from the inside. In that moment, you understand something no minstrel ever sang and no court ever proclaimed. Chivalry was never meant for people like you. Or her. We grow up imagining knights as paragons of honor, bound by sacred vows, rescuers of the helpless. But peel away the gold leaf manuscripts and heroic tapestries, and you'll find a code that protected the powerful, not the powerless. Behind the shining armor and oaths of purity were practices so disturbing, so intimate, that chroniclers hesitated to write them down. And when they did, their words were buried in monastery vaults, locked away from public eyes for centuries. Tonight, we open that vault. You're about to learn what the songs of courtly love never told you, how war brides were claimed as prizes, how vows of chastity hid secret brothels inside monastic orders, how squires endured sexualized hazing rituals that broke them long before battle did, and how elite pleasure orders of knights wielded desire as a weapon of political control. These were not accidents or individual sins. They were woven into the machinery of medieval knighthood, systematic, organized, and enforced through law, custom, and the iron silence of those who benefited. This isn't the story of a few bad apples, tarnishing a noble ideal. This is the story of a class of warriors who lived by a double code, one for the songs and one for the shadows. What you're about to hear comes from inquisitorial trial records, royal decrees, eyewitness accounts from chroniclers, and the confessions of knights themselves. Some extracted under torture, others spoken in moments when death was certain and reputations no longer mattered. If the thought of your childhood heroes being complicit in these acts feels like betrayal, good. That means you've still got the instinct for justice that the medieval world so often ignored. Because when the hall doors closed and the guards turned away, the code of chivalry was not about honor. It was about ownership. And in the centuries when knights ruled battlefields and courts alike, ownership extended to bodies. Living, breathing, unwilling bodies. If this is already shattering what you thought you knew about chivalry, and you're still not subscribed to the history scar, then why are you here just watching? Hit subscribe before you pretend you didn't hear this. And if you honestly think you can hear all this and walk away, at least have the courage to say why in the comments. For centuries, poets and storytellers crafted a vision of knighthood so polished it gleamed brighter than any blade. In the verses of troubadours, knights were the champions of unrequited love, risking life and limb for the honor of a lady whose beauty could tame even the wildest heart. Courtly love became the badge of refinement. A man might fight a dozen duels for a single smile. But this poetry was a mask. Beneath it lay a shadow system in which love was rarely unrequited, because it was rarely asked for in the first place. The lofty language of devotion concealed something far more transactional. Sexual access reserved for those who wore the right armor and bore the right crest. The feudal system was built on hierarchy, lords at the top, vassals below, peasants at the bottom, and in that hierarchy, knights often stood closer to their lords than to the people they were meant to defend. This closeness granted them not only land, loot, and privilege, but access. Sometimes that access was framed as a custom, other times as a right. You may have heard of droit du seigneur, the so-called right of the first night, the idea that a lord could sleep with a newly married bride before her husband. Historians still debate whether it was widespread practice or political smear. But in the chaos of war and the isolation of castle life, the difference between myth and reality was blurred by power. A law didn't have to exist on parchment for it to be enforced in practice. And there were other ways to exercise the same privilege without claiming an outright right. A captured castle could become a knight's hunting ground for more than treasure. The siege ended, the flags were raised, and women were quietly separated from the men. Under the cover of celebration, these spoils of war were divided and claimed, just like armor or horses. It was an unspoken economy, traded in whispers and locked behind gates. Even tournaments, the grand spectacles meant to display a knight's skill, were not as pure as the songs suggest. Some were explicitly advertised as offering rewards beyond the victory purse, rewards that could include the company of women presented as part of the prize. These women were often camp followers, debtors' daughters, or war captives whose presence was justified as part of the festivities. The records of the siege of Limoges in 1370 pull back the curtain further. Chroniclers like Jean Froissart wrote of the massacre that followed, but buried in those accounts are references to women taken alive, marched away under guard while their homes still burned. They were not hostages for ransom. They were part of the plunder, traded, gifted, or kept, depending on the captor's favor. This was the chivalry no poet sang about. A code that spoke of honor in daylight but operated by an entirely different set of rules when the doors closed and the ink dried. The same men who knelt for blessings before battle could stand in a conquered hall and decide the fate of every living soul within it. War was supposed to be the proving ground of a knight's valor, the place where courage was measured, where honor was earned. But on the long roads between battles, in the dust and stench of the campaign trail, another reality took shape. The same tents that sheltered war councils and prayer vigils also hid a quieter, darker economy, one in which bodies became part of the spoils before the fighting had even ended. Every army that marched carried more than swords and banners. It carried a shadow population, camp followers. Some were wives or sweethearts who refused to be left behind, but many more were women who cooked, washed clothes, mended armor, and, whether by coercion or survival, offered sexual services. For the knights, these women were part of the logistics of war, no different from the blacksmith or the baggage cart. Payment could be in coin, food, or the unspoken understanding that refusal wasn't an option. In the Crusades, this took on an even more disturbing form. The holy cause draped itself in the language of purity, yet knights routinely kept concubines in captured cities. Some were taken from among the local Christian population, others from the Muslim or Jewish communities. Chroniclers wrote of them in passing, often describing them as companions, without acknowledging the absence of consent. William of Tyre, a 12th-century historian, described how in Jerusalem and Antioch, knights would select for themselves women from the conquered, sometimes keeping them for years. In their minds, these arrangements were not crimes but privileges of conquest, rewards for risking life and limb on the battlefield. The line between pillage and possession was almost non-existent. When a city fell, knights didn't just strip its churches of gold and silver. They stripped its streets of women and girls, herded them into makeshift enclosures, and parceled them out among the victors. The chronicler Robert of Clary, writing about the Fourth Crusade sack of Constantinople, admitted bluntly that alongside jewels and relics, women were taken as part of the division of spoils. And before battle, the church sometimes made the knight's moral burden even lighter. Mass was said, confessions heard, and absolution granted, in advance. They were told their sins would be forgiven in the name of the holy cause. What happened after the walls were breached was between them and God had already signed the pardon. The victims were not only foreign captives. In occupied territories, widows of slain nobles and commoners alike became easy prey. Their lands were seized, their homes confiscated, and their bodies treated as part of the inheritance. Some were forced into marriage with their captors, others placed under the protection of knights whose intentions were anything but honorable. Even nuns, cloistered and veiled, were not beyond reach. During the 100 Years' War, there are recorded instances of abbeys being raided, the sisters driven out or taken into the custody of knights who claimed to be rescuing them. Once removed from the convent walls, their fate was rarely a return to holy life. This was the reality inside the campaign tents and behind the castle gates after the banners of victory were raised. The chronicles speak of glory and honor, but between the lines, they tell another story. One where the battlefield ended at the city walls, but the conquest continued in every home, every cloister, and every camp. They called themselves warriors of God. Men who took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. The Templars, the Hospitallers, the Teutonic Knights, they were the holy sword arms of Christendom, sworn to protect pilgrims and defend the faith. Their banners bore the cross. Their seals showed two knights sharing a single horse, a symbol of humility. But behind the fortress walls of their commanderies, the life they led was not always the one they preached. In cities from Acre to Paris, Whispers circulated about the guest houses, conveniently located near the quarters of knightly orders. To outsiders, they were taverns or lodging for visiting merchants. But records from city tax rolls and testimonies from court cases reveal that many of these establishments were brothels, some operating under the order's silent protection. The proximity was no coincidence. These places catered to the men sworn never to touch a woman, offering what the vows forbade while shielding the participants from prying eyes. Penitential records from the 13th and 14th centuries contain cryptic notations: fines levied for carnal lapse, penances assigned for indiscretions with women. Sometimes the language is even more direct, naming knights caught in flagranti with local prostitutes or with the wives of merchants. The punishment was often symbolic: a pilgrimage, a period of fasting, but the knight remained in the order, his sword and rank intact. And those pilgrimages themselves? Many routes to holy sites became arteries for another kind of traffic. Under the protection of the knights, caravans were not only carrying relics and supplies but also moving people, women and girls, from one city to another. Officially, they were companions or servants to pilgrims. In reality, some were unwilling captives being delivered to distant markets, hidden in the columns of church-sanctioned processions. Inside the orders, secrecy was a weapon. A knight who broke his vows could be punished, but he could also be blackmailed. In an institution where purity was part of its very legitimacy, the threat of exposure could bend a man to the will of his superiors. Obedience was absolute, and if obedience required silence about the sins of others, the code demanded compliance. The Templar trials in the early 14th century, though clouded by political agendas, surfaced confessions of unnatural acts between brothers in the order. Whether all were true or forced under torture is still debated, but the fact remains: where men lived for years in isolation from women, desire sought other outlets. Some of those outlets were consensual, many were not. The cloak of holy war covered both. The contradiction was stark. The same knight who might spend his morning tending to the sick in the hospital or infirmary could, by nightfall, be crossing the threshold of a brothel run under his order's protection. Yet the myth of celibacy endured, a shining emblem to the outside world, untarnished by the shadows inside the fortress. If you're feeling uncomfortable right now, that's the point. But imagine never hearing it because you didn't subscribe, and then watching history's ugliest truths get buried again. Subscribe to the History Scar now, or explain in the comments why keeping silent feels safer. In the world of medieval knighthood, women were not just part of the scenery, they were assets. Their value could be counted in gold, land, and political advantage. And when war scattered the pieces of the chessboard, knights often played for more than territory. They played for people. Among the most coveted prizes were high-born women. Capturing the wife, daughter, or sister of a noble enemy was not only a blow to morale but a chance for immense profit. Ransom was the official justification, and it could indeed yield fortunes. But there was a darker arrangement that history records only in hints and whispers: ransoms that came with conditions, including forced marriage to the captor. The union legitimized his claim over her lands, and over her body, all under the seal of feudal law. Even when marriage was not forced, the period between capture and release was one of utter vulnerability. Chroniclers describe women kept in guarded chambers while negotiations dragged on, sometimes for months. The accounts gloss over what happened in those months, but the silences speak louder than the words. Not every woman had a ransom to be paid. Peasant women and townsfolk taken in raids were not held for gold, they were traded like livestock between knights and lords. The value of a captive was determined by a ruthless hierarchy: noble women at the top, then the wives and daughters of wealthy merchants, then skilled servants, and finally the anonymous poor. Foreign captives, especially those from lands seen as enemies, could fetch higher prices in certain markets, valued as exotic curiosities in noble courts. Knights did not need a battlefield to acquire such prizes. Some tournaments, those grand public displays of martial skill, were known to feature women as part of the spoils. The chronicles of certain court festivals mentioned trophies presented to victors, a word that could mean a fine cloak, a warhorse, or a woman. In some cases, these were camp followers dressed in finery to disguise their true status. In others, they were captives taken in recent raids, their fate decided by the outcome of a joust. Marriage alliances sealed under such circumstances were framed as chivalric romance, the rescue of a lady from her captor. But the truth was often closer to a transaction: The rescue arranged in advance with her family in exchange for political or economic advantage. And for women without powerful relatives to intervene, there was no escape at all. The language of chivalry wrapped these acts in honor and pageantry. The knights were portrayed as gallant protectors, the women as willing brides. But beneath the banners and the blessings, the market logic remained. Every woman's worth could be calculated, and every calculation served the ambitions of the men who claimed her. The war bride market was not a single event or a formal institution. It was a system, woven into the fabric of knighthood, where conquest did not end with the surrender of the enemy but with the possession of everything, and everyone, the enemy had left. You've sat through this much filth from history and you're still holding that subscribe hostage? What are you waiting for? A knight's permission. If you don't want to subscribe, fine, but at least tell us in the comments why you're choosing silence over truth. Becoming a knight was supposed to be the culmination of discipline, loyalty, and years of training. But for many squires, the final steps toward knighthood were not marked by solemn ceremony alone. Hidden behind the pageantry of dubbing ceremonies were rites of passage that stripped away not just dignity, but sometimes humanity itself. Hazing was common in the Brotherhood of Arms, and in some places, it was deliberately humiliating. Squires were made to endure long nights of testing, where they would be paraded before their elders, ordered to strip naked, and forced to perform degrading tasks. The stated reason was to teach humility. But the reality was that these trials often turned into a display for the amusement or gratification of those in power. Accounts from later chroniclers hint at sexual humiliation woven into these rituals, with older knights asserting dominance over their juniors in ways that went far beyond a mere trial of endurance. Such behavior wasn't confined to the shadows of training halls. The charges leveled during the Templar trials in the early 14th century, though politically motivated, included accusations of heretical rites and secret orgies. Some confessions spoke of initiation ceremonies involving forced intimacy between members, acts framed as tests of loyalty or as symbolic denials of conventional morality. Whether all of these accounts were true or manufactured under torture is debated, but they reflect a perception that knightly brotherhoods could harbor rituals far removed from Christian virtue. Sexual violence was not only a weapon of initiation, it was also a tool of interrogation. Prisoners taken in battle, especially those suspected of hiding information, could be subjected to sexualized torture. Medieval records describe prisoners stripped naked, bound, and subjected to violations meant to break both body and spirit. These acts were often done in full view of others as a warning. Resistance would cost more than your life. Even civilians could find themselves targeted for such spectacles. Women accused of dishonoring a knight, sometimes for resisting advances, sometimes for gossip, and sometimes for nothing more than being in the wrong place at the wrong time, could be subjected to public shaming rituals. These punishments were designed to invert the ideals of chivalry. A common method was ritualized stripping. The woman would be paraded through the streets with her hair shorn and her clothes torn away, jeered at by crowds, her humiliation serving as both punishment and entertainment. Branding was another favored penalty, a mark burned into the skin to signify her crime. In some towns, the victim was forced to carry symbolic objects, like a broken lance or a torn banner, meant to mock the knight she had allegedly insulted. Such events blurred the line between justice and spectacle. For the watching public, they reinforced the image of the knight as the final arbiter of honor. For the victim, they erased the possibility of ever reclaiming her dignity. Behind the polished armor and the tales of noble tournaments, these rituals reveal a truth that chivalry storytellers never wanted told, that the power of knighthood was not confined to the battlefield. It reached into the most private and vulnerable corners of human life, shaping it through fear, humiliation, and the assertion of total control. The age of knights eventually faded. Gunpowder replaced the lance. Armies became professional rather than feudal. The great orders were disbanded or repurposed. But the scars left by their darker practices did not vanish when the banners came down. They were written into the laws, the land, and the lives of those who survived them. Medieval law bears traces of this history in its treatment of women and captives. Rules about inheritance often excluded women who had been compromised, a term that could mean anything from elopement to abduction by knights during wartime. Lands taken through forced marriage were legitimized under feudal charters. In some regions, the church issued new regulations aimed at curbing abuses by men who claimed authority through arms. Yet these reforms rarely addressed the past, leaving victims without justice and their stories unrecorded except in the whispered histories of their families. Some of those stories survived in folklore, their edges softened by time but their core truths intact. In rural France, ballads tell of the Black Knight, who came in the night and left a trail of ruin behind. In England, ghost tales linger about ladies of the manor who wander castle halls in torn wedding gowns, searching for the lives they might have lived. In the Levant, old tales speak of Christian and Muslim women who vanished during the Crusades, only to reappear years later under strange names and foreign husbands. These are not just ghost stories. They are the cultural memory of a society that lived for centuries in the shadow of armored power. Yet today, when we think of knights, what comes to mind? Not the prisoner marched from a burning town. Not the young squire humiliated before his peers. Not the widow bargaining for her safety with the man who took her husband's life. Instead, we think of gallant rescues, glittering tournaments, and a code of honor unbroken by human weakness. We have romanticized them into something they never were, polishing away the blood and the shame until only the gleam remains. This romantic vision has consequences. When we tell ourselves that power always comes with honor, we make it harder to see abuse when it wears the right uniform or speaks the right words. We teach ourselves to ignore the stories that don't fit the myth. And so the same dynamics that once let a knight claim a captive as a prize can still be found in modern forms. In workplaces, in politics, in any structure where hierarchy shields the powerful from scrutiny. The myth of chivalry isn't just a harmless fairy tale. It is a reminder that history can be rewritten, that violence can be buried under poetry, and that the truth will vanish if no one insists on telling it. The victims of these centuries-old abuses cannot speak for themselves anymore. But their absence should haunt us, just as surely as it haunted the people who lived in their time. You have now heard what the ballads left out. You have seen the shadow cast by the shining armor. And if you made it this far, you know that these stories deserve to be remembered, not hidden behind banners and songs. If you made it here and you still won't subscribe to the History Scar, you might as well comment why, because after this much truth, silence is almost a crime. Like this video if you believe history should be told unvarnished. Share it so others can see the side of the knights they were never meant to know. And leave your thoughts below. Every comment forces the algorithm to carry these voices further. The myths will survive without us. The truth will not.